Give it up one more time for Sivan, and please welcome to the stage, Chris Himes. Chris Himes.
Thank you. My fifth grade teacher, Mr. Curtis, stood up in front of the classroom the day after we got back from spring break and looked out at the class and said, well, Chris had something interesting happen in her family last week. And I sat there sort of stunned, unsure what I should say, because the interesting thing that had happened in my family last week was that my 5-year-old sister had been killed in a hit-and-run car accident. I grew up on a dead-end street in rural Indiana, and most of the other residents were older couples or widowed women. So our household with 8 kids was really unusual, even in the time of the baby boom, and we weren't Catholic. But our yard was filled with bikes and toys and noise and a little bit of chaos, and it was a good family, but a big one. And when I grew up, free-range parenting was just parenting. So it wasn't really that odd that my younger sisters and brother had been allowed to walk down our dead-end street to the main street and up a little ways to a community building where there was a rummage sale. They didn't have to cross any streets, there wasn't a lot of traffic. But on the way back, for some reason, they did decide to cross the street, and that's when my sister was hit. It's amazing how quickly news could travel in the time before we had cell phones. And so before even the ambulance had arrived, there were these neighbor ladies who had descended on our house. And so they stayed busy kind of, cleaning and organizing and supervising. And I spent those hours trying to convince myself that nothing really bad could happen. I mean, maybe she had a broken arm or a broken leg. And it wasn't until my parents came home and told us all that my sister was dead that it really sort of hit home. So after that, there's the kind of whirlwind of activity that goes around with a funeral. So there's the visitation and the relatives from out of town and the food that people bring in, the burial, all of that stuff. And it all seemed to be kind of a blur. I mean, we all just kind of walked around a little bit in a daze, and none of it really seemed real. You know, sometimes there's armor that we put on to protect ourselves from things that can hurt us. And, I really wish there had been some kind of armor that my sister was wearing to protect her that day from that speeding car. But there's also sometimes the kind of armor we put on that is to protect ourselves from ourselves. And I think my parents, with the best of intentions, were trying to protect us from their grief. And so they put on this kind of cloak of silence. And as kids, we didn't want to remind my parents or my mother of this, what had happened and remind her of the loss. And so we were silent as well. So we had the funeral, we went back to school, we picked up our routines, and for all intents and purposes, we never spoke of my sister again. So it turns out that putting on that kind of armor and being silent about one thing, after a while it gets harder and harder to take it off. And it also means that you're silent about lots of other things. And so over time, all of the fears and losses and angers and grief just kind of build up inside. And I didn't think that they were really something that you should talk about, or even have the words that I would use if I did want to talk about them. And it wasn't until like 40 years later, when my mother died, that my brothers and sisters and I really sat down and talked about our sister and talked about that day. And it was a really hard conversation and gut-wrenchingly sad. But it was also kind of liberating to feel like we finally could put some voice to the things that we had felt. We compared our stories and memories of what had happened that day and all of the guilt and shame that people had felt and how it all had played out. And we also thought it was really important to talk a little bit about Martha's life. And so we shared some of our memories of her. And I always remember that my father one of his favorite memories was the day that Martha came in and said that she had seen Little Red Riding Hood on the street and had talked with her. And she was, a smart, creative, imaginative little girl. And I think, after that, of course, change doesn't happen overnight. You don't automatically feel like, oh, everything's okay and I can talk about everything. But slowly, it opened the door to learning, the language of emotions and being able to talk about things that are hard and talk about things that are sad. And I think in the end, you learn that while you think that this kind of armor is protecting you, there's really a way in which that armor is keeping you from really having the kind of life that you want to have. And it really feels good once you're able to take it off. Thanks.